These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. The year is 858 BCE, and Shalmaneser is gearing up for the inaugural military campaign which would fund and legitimize the start of his reign. His goal is to travel westward to reconfirm his father's great conquest 12 years prior, entering into regions which remain nominally submissive, but which don't seem to have concretely affirmed their submission in quite some time. I'll be honest, I don't see Shalmaneser as having the same driving scale of ambitions his father had had. I think if everyone on the borders had basically submitted to him, he wouldn't have had much cause to stir the pot too often, though, of course, an Assyrian king did always need enemies to march out against, so maybe he would have poked at the edges until he drew enough blood to satisfy the growing empire. But we're going to leave Shalmaneser a bit and head west ahead of the armies. We spent a whole year in Israel not too long ago, but that was well out of context of the rest of history, and it'll do us some good to recontextualize the West a bit. Starting at 1200, the epoch of the Bronze Age collapse opened with the Levant split between the Hittites and the Egyptians, the two empires now at peace, with relatively little jostling permitted among the tribes and statelets of Canaan in the south and Syria in the north. Even here, some consolidation was happening, most especially the famous Ahumu kingdom, which grew during a period of Egyptian neglect. But the states were largely kept weak and dependent on their overlords for security, though whether this was a policy or an accident on the part of the great powers is debatable. Then, almost simultaneously, invaders arrived. They came from the sea and from the desert. They came from across the Dardanelles and down from the Caucasus Mountains. There was even activity along the Iranian mountains, though fortunately for the Babylonians it wasn't nearly as significant as what they saw in the west. Egypt, Assyria, and the Hittites were all, at this very moment, weakened by internal disorder and low legitimacy, while Babylon was just recovering from a failed Assyrian conquest. So just by coincidence, the most significant foreign crisis of the age arrived just as the great powers were all uniquely ill-equipped to deal with it. With much of their protection stripped back, the wolves descended upon the flock. The only polities that survive intact from this are a handful of coastal trading cities, which become known as the Phoenicians. Surveying from south to north, closest to Egypt, you have some sea people groups who set up the Philistine Pentapolis. Surrounding them are the Habiru bands, who coalesce ultimately into the Kingdom of Israel, plus some smaller on and off vassal tribes like Judah and Edom. Directly north of that, you have some Aramean states, Damascus and Hamath, though the situation here was a bit more fluid. The further east you get from here, the more various tribes you encounter, and the shape of the map radically shifted generation to generation, and is in fact basically unmappable by modern historians. Anything that you may see on the internet or even on this show is very much a guesstimate. The difference between the Arameans in the sort of central and eastern part of the Levant and the southern Semites is in many ways a very subtle one. But basically, the southwestern Semites, in and around Canaan, had all long been influenced by Egyptian customs, while the northwest Semites were more Mesopotamia and Hurrian influenced. Neither was recognizably Egyptian or Mesopotamian. They were very much their own thing, nor did they typically carry obviously Egyptian or Babylonian totems around. But what we can broadly now term Phoenicians, Arameans, and Israelites are all basically the same people, but each has faced a set of pressures and influences that have caused them to diverge in three different directions and built separate sets of worldviews and social structures. Honestly, if the 10th century wasn't such a wretched dark-aged history, the tripartite divergence of Aramean, Phoenician, and Israelite cultures would have been one of the most famous case studies of ancient culture. The odds of us having enough data to actually flesh that out are pretty slim in practice. But honestly, if I was a PhD student, I would want that as my dissertation topic, because if successful, talking about that sort of thing, it's the sort of thesis that would make you instantly an academic rock star. You write a book like that, you get a lot of people very interested. And every time I write another episode of anything, I wish I didn't have a job and I could just do studying all day. But if you're a young person in college, quit your partying. You're not going to wish you partied more. You're going to wish you wrote stuff like this about the tripartite division of the southern Levantine Semitic cultures. That's the sort of thing that's really going to invigorate your youth. Anyway, I leave Hittite influence out of that three-way split because in the Aramean and Canaanite lands, Hittite influence seems to have been pretty even. You can find some all the way down in Israel. You can find about the same amount in Phoenicia and the more distant Aramean states. Heading north, however, we get into the Neo-Hittite statelets. In a band from southwest Anatolia to the Euphrates River, you have a group of cities who are difficult to describe exactly. They're a product of the Bronze Age collapse. As people from across the world were forced to abandon their homes, one of the most popular places to seek refuge was in the famously wealthy lands of northern Syria, places which had once been a major crossroads of trade. People from all over Anatolia, people from across the Armenian highlands, Semitic peoples of Canaan and the southern deserts all ended up in these melting pots. And through a quirk of history, so too did a great deal of people who could claim some level of Hittite nobility. It started with Carchemish, which genuinely was ruled by a cousin of the Hittite king. But Aleppo also wanted to get in on the action, they also having a claim to the Hittite bloodline. And soon enough, everyone was claiming to be a Hittite royal nephew or cousin or former roommate or some such. Usually, they were the ones there first, these vaguely Hittite nobles, and everyone else was a recent immigrant. So where there were too many groups to form a single ethnic power block out of any single one of them, Hittite often seems to have become the default. As time passed, various Aramean tribes were increasingly able to form that unified power block in individual areas, and the polity in those particular places transformed from our much later historical perspective from a Neo-Hittite into an Aramean one. But such transitions, they were often messy and partial, not so much sweeping ideological revolutions and not so much like naked power grabs, as much as they were a series of adjustments and compromises over generations, at least as far as we can tell. The culture was decidedly a mix in all these cities, with the specifics of the mix changing from place to place, and leadership style seems to have existed on a spectrum, with each specific leader borrowing from Luwian Hittite presentations, or Aramean tribal despotisms, and classical Hittite legal structures as best fit their own situation. Now, this potent mix churned over the centuries, but never really managed to settle into a single thing, nor coalesce into a single or small set of kingdoms. And I will recommend, I'm forgetting the exact name, I'm going to put it right here unless I forget. Trevor Bryce has the best single book on Neo-Hittite statelets. The World of the Neo-Hittites, maybe? You'll see the actual title down here, unless I forget. I do recommend that book. People have asked me to start recommending books more often, but it's a very difficult book to read because this is just an absolute mess of a time period. A fascinating mess, but there's just so little to get your hands on. Anyway, it's deeply unclear why the region was so fragmented when the southern Semitic kingdoms were able to form a handful of powerful states. But by the 9th century, that fragmentation would come to have significant implications. It's an interesting thing to wonder what would have eventually settled out had the Hittites been given more time to settle. But the truth is that no one in history ever really gets to just sit and work their problems out without outside forces trying to knock them over. Ashurnasirpal's entry in 870 had been something of a shock. Here was someone on a whole different level, a sort of great power, entering a region that had not seen anything of the sort in a very long time. And it is possible that the sheer shock contributed to how easy things went for Ashurnasirpal and how quiet the region was in his wake. Perhaps the various Levantine states simply assumed that Assyria was very far away, and that surely they would not be able to consistently push their influence much past the Euphrates River, the region's natural border. The truth is, though, that we don't know quite what they're thinking at this point. Quite likely, some of the reason we don't know is that Aramean has taken over as the region's dominant language. Aramean is a language that's not really intended to be carved in clay the way cuneiform is. It's far closer in sort of general shape to modern alphabetic languages, and it's intended for writing with ink on parchment or papyrus or wooden surfaces or leather or things like that. Because it's written on a less durable medium, for all that this likely had positive effects for literacy and access to writing, we start to see a steep decline in surviving records, even during relatively prosperous times. This mismatch between prosperity and written record is going to steadily grow from this until it peaks under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which has far less surviving records than it should have given its stability and literacy due to the steady erosion of these less durable records. The Neo-Hittites, though, are far less stable and prosperous than the great empires, and this instability is also contributing to their relative silence, which is why we only know about most of these areas when we hear the Assyrians report that they've conquered and subjugated them. And that, conquest and subjugation, is exactly Shalmaneser's action plan here in 858. Specifically, he wants to return to the region, wash his weapons in the waters of the distant sea, and collect tribute and submission all around. This, he decided, would cause his glory to match that of his father's, and in a future year, he would be able to build on that by expanding further west, possibly even marching as far into Anatolia as the fabled conquests of Sargon of Akkad, whose legend is becoming ever more celebrated in the culture of the 9th century. However, there are already issues. Not unexpected issues, but certainly irksome ones. Ahumu, king of Bit-Adini. Remember that. That name will be on the test. Ahumu is king of Bit-Adini, which is an Aramean kingdom dominating much of the western Euphrates, the eastern bank of the western Euphrates, and has been brought into submission by force, and Ashurnasirpal's psychotic fury had been sufficient to keep this king in line. However, now that there's a new king, Ahumu had interpreted his vassalage as a personal accord, just between himself and Ashurnasirpal, not a submission to the god or the state of Ashur. And so, with the change in king, Ahumu decided that his diplomatic status had naturally changed as well. In late spring or early summer, Shalmaneser led his army along the northern route, along the foothills north of the Khabar region, to the Bit-Adini city of Lalatu, where the enemy lord was staying. Once the army arrived, however, it turned out that Ahumu was no longer staying there. He had heard the army was coming, and quite wisely fled to his capital of Tel-Barsip. Shalmaneser took advantage of the city's weakness to pillage and burn the city, but that gave Ahumu time to raise his own army from the capital city. A few weeks later, the two met in open battle outside the walls of Tel-Barsip, and while the Assyrian army was victorious, enough of the Bit-Adini army was able to retreat behind some high stone walls, and Shalmaneser simply had too much planned for the year to sit and conduct a full siege operation. Leaving a modest garrison to keep Tel-Barsip locked down, the king took the main army to another Bit-Adini city, Burmarina, and defeated the small garrison there, capturing the city. He did not destroy this city, though he did make a tower of heads from the executed captives to let Tel-Barsip know about their anticipated fate, and instead seems to have stationed himself right there in Burmarina for a bit, letting other nations know that he would soon be defeating the rebellious Bit-Adini, and they would be well served to send in their tribute now, before they ended up with the same fate as Ahumu. While he was in residence there, he got tribute from 3 local kings, and as he was on his way out, another tribute bearer arrived from another nearby kingdom. And then he attacked another city of the Bit-Adini and defeated it. However, the modest garrison around Tel-Barsip simply wasn't going to break through those stone walls and those strong Neo-Hittite fortifications. And so Shalmaneser decided that the cost of the siege was starting to outweigh the benefits, and brought his army back together to leave the injured but unbowed Aramean kingdom and keep moving. This, too, it would turn out, would prove to be as potent an example as the stack of heads, but an example in a very different direction. Moving west, the army entered the city of Gurgum, where the local lords celebrated with tribute and submission, including offering one of the lord's daughters to Shalmaneser, tying this city to Ashur in a more significant way, and, he hopes, securing his defense, should any of those other Neo-Hittite or Aramean statelets decide to threaten him. Once that party is finished, Shalmaneser enters the land of Sam'al, expecting that lord to fet him in a similar fashion. However, Ha'yanu, the Sam'alite, who had been looking very closely at the army's actions on the march thus far, was starting to have some ideas. It's never a good thing. Only the king is allowed to have ideas. Vastly reduced were the atrocities that had accompanied Ashurnasirpal's fearsome march west. The determined slaughter and relentless march may have been slackened. Most tellingly, the rebellious town of Tel-Barsip had been bypassed after a desultory siege not annihilated mercilessly. Ha'yanu was wondering if the edge had been worn off the Assyrian military machine, if perhaps this new king was not the equal of his father. Besides, they were now more familiar with how the Assyrians fought, giving the king and some of his neighbors ideas for how they could be defeated. And it wasn't only Ha'yanu thinking like this. The Hittite kings Sangara of Carchemish and Sapulalume of Patin were also uninterested in permitting Assyrian domination in the region. And so, when the Assyrian army reached the gates of Lutabu, where Ha'yanu was residing, they found themselves not welcomed, but opposed by Carchemish, Patin, Sam'al, and the bypassed Bit-Adini. The resulting battle was fierce, and Shalmaneser claims that the key tactical moments involved presenting the divine standard of Ashur upon the battlefield, and the god's direct intervention in the fight, with Shalmaneser imbued with divine radiance and entering personally into the battle like a hacker with cheat codes on to dominate the match. The enemy coalition was defeated and pursued, then hacked down where they stood. Small towns in the area were burned and piles of heads were made from the fallen enemies. But no mention is actually made of breaching the Neo-Hittite walls of Lutabu itself, nor of any of the enemies actually submitting or offering tribute. The battle wasn't a complete loss, but a second enemy in this campaign was able to push an Assyrian army from its gates. A bad precedent. Shalmaneser, though, is focused on his religious duty. The gods wanted him to reach the sea, and likely his own idea of kingship was centered around reaching the sea, or just accomplishing whatever his goal happened to be. And all the obstacles in the way were things to be smashed through, distractions from the purpose. But now that he's through the band of resistance, he climbs up Mount Amanus, visits the source of the Salura River, and constructs a massive statue with an inscription of his heroism. The gods are satisfied, but there is still one more hurdle to be crossed before reaching the sea. At the Orontes River, he must pass through the land of Patin, and there will be no way to rush across. Sapalalume, a corruption of the glorious Hittite name Shipilaliuma, which shows the cultural distance between the Neo-Hittites and their imperial forebears, has called the coalition to Patin, and the coalition has only grown bolder after their showing that absolute annihilation is not inevitable when facing the Assyrians. Ahumu of Bit-Adini is there, of course, like the nemesis of a film, as is Carchemish and Sam-Al. But they are now also joined by a force from distant Que in Anatolia, the region classically known as Kilikia, as well as the Neo-Hittite and Aramean mixed force from Hilukea, Isbukea, and Ehanea. Shalmaneser parks his army in front of this coalition, whose exact size is unknown, as is the size of the Assyrian army, and he pauses to ask the god Ashur whether he should attack this army or find some other path. The god says to stop hesitating and attack. And with the blessing of the Assyrian god, the Assyrian army smashes the coalition army, and then they just start smashing cities all through the land of Patin. And then they just sort of let the murderous momentum basically pull them forward. They end up crossing the border into Amaru, a kingdom who has not been mentioned yet as being involved, but may have been associated with some of those smaller, more obscure kingdoms. And entering into Amaru, they just start smashing the place up with minimal resistance. Shalmaneser sweeps through like a flood, leaving nothing but devastation in his wake until finally arriving at the sea shore. Here he receives tribute from kings, though he doesn't list them, so that it was likely too minor of an episode to really write home about. But he did build a statue to himself. He marched up and down the beach for a while in a little parade, and then he got some cedar wood from Mount Amanus, all with the appropriate pomp and piety. In the denouement of his great expedition, having defeated the coalition army, he returned back to Assyria by way of Patin, where he took the opportunity to smash a few more cities and round up some 15,000 captives. You know, like you do. Ahumu of Bit-Adini, the man who seems to have started the whole matter, apologized with a submissive tribute of gifts for the king and seems to have avoided immediate retribution. I say immediate. Retribution is coming, but either Bit-Adini still has too much strength in reserve, or the Assyrian army is too exhausted to bully them on this leg of the trip. And that gets us to basically the central question of Shalmaneser's reign. This campaign was intended to closely emulate his father's campaign from about a decade ago, and yet it went, honestly, pretty bad. Yes, the Assyrian army was able to reach the coastline. Yes, they did ultimately kind of win. But whereas Ashur-Nasirpal had arrived in total destructive dominance, Shalmaneser had to fight for each step, sometimes even stepping around obstacles rather than smashing right through them. Shalmaneser, is he more timid than his father? And the army, is it less capable? Or is it the case that being less psychopathic has caused the enemy to fear him less? Or is it a third option, that the people of the Levant are simply more ready for the Assyrian army now, more willing to form coalitions and resist now that they know firsthand what exactly they're dealing with? Put another way, had Ashur-Nasirpal still been king in 858, would he have managed to smash through all this resistance as easily as he had in 870? Or would he have also struggled against Ahumu and his allies? Perhaps there wouldn't have even been a coalition to stand against them. But the truth is that, given our limited and mostly official sources here, there's simply no way to tell. My own guess here, which is how I'm going to be telling the story from here on out, is that the Assyrian army is just as capable as it has been, and Shalmaneser is basically the equal of his father in terms of on-the-field leadership, or that he has competent enough generals directly under him that the same result obtains. But the people of the Near East are less afraid of him because he isn't quite so needlessly cruel. And also they have more willingness and ability to resist the Assyrians, or at least to more often attempt such resistance. This has moral implications that I'm going to continue hinting at without really getting into it, which will no doubt frustrate at least one of the people who sometimes emails me. But that sort of moral theorizing is what my alternate channel, Christ and Questions, is all about. Check it out on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. Anyway, Shalmaneser gets back home, and even though we can sit here and compare his performance to his father's, it's very hard not to, he still did well enough to portray his inaugural year as a clear success. He arrives with wagons full of plunder and tribute, hauled by the thousands and thousands of captives that he had secured from the west. He reported to the god, consulted his divinations, distributed spoils to the important houses, and ends up in Nineveh as the next year begins. Assembling the army, they head again to the west. Ahumu of Bit-Adini had given gifts and a measure of submission at the end of last year's campaign, but that was too little, too late. Even the more relaxed Shalmaneser can't let the leader of such a large coalition off scot-free. So the army marches toward Tel Barsip, where Ahumu is holed up, and they fight a battle outside the gates. The Assyrians win the battle, but are again held off by the mighty walls of the town. No doubt frustrated by now, the king opts to leave a contingent of the army encircling Tel Barsip, while the rest of the army continues on, to make sure that the city starves and suffers for much of the year and to devastate the countryside. It isn't just sadism, trying to make the people suffer for no reason. Shalmaneser will return as many times as it takes, choking off the city during its most productive months and preventing planting after planting until the city falls. Why can't he take the city, given that we've already seen the Assyrians in full possession of the complete range of siege tactics at this point? I have no idea. Our sources lack that level of detail, but something is missing here. And so, Tel Barsip will just remain, trapped like a bird in a cage. Meanwhile, the rest of the army sacks 6 major Bit-Adini cities, with slaughter, plunder, burning, and mass enslavement all around. With much of Bit-Adini devastated, the army moves into the territory of Carchemish, where he takes the Carchemishite satellite city of Sazabu. This conquest is a full siege and a full conquest, with all the subsequent destruction that implies. Off the back of this victory, however, Shalmaneser is able to send out a demand that all the other former members of the enemy coalition submit to him, and Carchemish and Patin capitulate, as do many Neo-Hittite and Aramean states all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. These together all offer a variety of expensive tribute, as well as, importantly, ongoing annual taxes paid in cedar wood and cedar resin, which will be valuable for the state in general and specifically allow for Shalmaneser to use that wood to expand the temple of Imgur-Enlil. Now, I don't remember if we mentioned it under Ashurnasirpal, but Shalmaneser's father had rebuilt the dilapidated temple of Enlil in the city of Imgur. He may have also done a bunch of reconstruction on the town itself. Imgur wasn't a hugely significant town in the broader scheme of things, but Enlil was an important god, and Imgur was home to one of his most significant northern temples. Enlil, god of kingship, was an important god for great kings to patronize, and so Shalmaneser made sure to continue expanding the temple with the plunder from those western victories in particular. Which is all well and good. No doubt many temples were able to see some improvement from all this plunder and the plunder of subsequent years. But this particular temple of Enlil becomes a significant factor archaeologically, because Shalmaneser added a wing to the temple with a pair of massive doors called the Balawat Gates. These are wood doors banded with bronze strips, and these bronze strips were engraved with extensive images of Shalmaneser's military campaigns, probably his western ones, which are now our single best source of information about the makeup of the Assyrian military. Now, a Roman historian would look at this, it's a gate, and he'd shrug and he'd toss it in his large pile of contemporary sources. But for Assyria, an engraved door becomes one of the most significant finds in an entire century of history. Piecing tiny fragments together, plus these annals texts, is a massive undertaking, and all I do is report and retell what the real heroes of history have assembled in their many careers. As we spend our time with these ancient stories, we should never forget the absolute giants who have built our knowledge on the basis of such small things. But after we're done being humbled by the majesty of academia, Shalmaneser needs to march out again, now in the year 856, because even though he has perhaps been a bit softer than expected, there is still absolutely no way at this point that Ahumu is going to get away with his nonsense, and the army marches straight back to Tel Barsip. Now, Tel Barsip is the only focus this year. They're going to take care of it, no matter what it takes. Part of that is the rest of the Mediterranean, the rest of the Levant, all the way to the Mediterranean, they are still paying their tribute. They really do seem to have been subdued, not so much with the shock of Ashurnasirpal's psychotic rages, but with Shalmaneser's dogged determination. A small Neo-Hittite city can raise a big army one year and maybe really push, but then they've got to recover for a while. The Assyrians don't have to recover. They can bring their army year after year after year after year and just pummel whatever needs pummeling, though only in one direction at a time. We'll get to that in a bit. The army is right at Tel-Barsip, and they are ready to do whatever is necessary, be that mass assaults or extended sieging. But what seems to have happened this time is that the Bit-Adini army marched out as the Assyrians approached the city walls, and again, they did battle in front of the walls. But this battle seems to have been cover for Ahumu and his guards to escape. Ahumu had rafts prepared to make his way out even while the Euphrates was in flood, and Shalmaneser didn't care to put the effort required in to follow him. The Assyrian king has no idea where Ahumu goes at this point, but we find out later that he's holed up in a mountain fortress further upriver. Leaving Ahumu, though, or rather, allowing him to leave while we stay at Tel-Barsip, the city falls quickly now that its king has fled and its army has been defeated before the walls. And in the face of this, Shalmaneser recognizes that it's not the people of the city who have been resisting, but the king and the soldiers. Since the soldiers are already defeated and the king has fled, he goes relatively easy on the town. It helps as well that the Assyrians can easily see the value of this well-fortified city, and so Shalmaneser founds a new royal palace for himself in the city atop Ahumu's old palace, and renames the city to its perhaps more famous designation, Kar Shalmaneser. Some other Bit-Adini cities also get renamed from Aramean to Assyrian names and get integrated fairly peaceably as a new province of the Mat Asher. Realistically, this is about the best possible thing that could have happened to the poor people of Bit-Adini at this point. Having wave upon wave of Assyrian army crash upon them year after year has devastated the region, people, crops, and livestock alike. The actual sieges for those inside of the city would have seen significant famine deaths, and for those outside the city, many would have already been swept up in the violence or in the slave raids that the military was running. By the normal Assyria conquest logic, such a resistant region would have capped these hellish years off with an orgy of murderous public torture, maiming, and enslavement. But no, if you had survived up to this point in and around Bit-Adini and Tel-Barsip, you would now be left in your farmstead or to your trade. The upper levels of society would be completely replaced by Assyrians now, and more Assyrian citizens are being bussed in to take up the farmsteads and properties left abandoned by the war victims. But there's more than enough to go around. There's been a lot of death, there's a lot of spare land. Politically, you, as a former Aramean subject, will find yourself a little bit less important than these imported Assyrians, but the average farmer wasn't all that important politically to begin with, and taxation will become regular, probably even suspended for a few years during the Reconstruction, and within a generation or so, things will be back to normal, but under the framework of the wealthier and safer Assyrian Empire. Ahumu, meanwhile, would be chased down in the following year. The mountain stronghold he was hiding in was probably better defended than his former city in material terms, but he has far fewer people and resources, and Shalmaneser has no reason to preserve anything at all of a random mountain. So he demolishes the walls, defeats those who fight back, decapitates those who surrender, and cart back Ahumu and his top retinues in chains as the king's personal property. We don't hear what happened afterwards, but it's impossible to imagine that Ahumu much enjoyed his stay in the city of Asher. You know, Hollywood taught me that scrappy freedom fighters always come out on top in the end, but the Assyrian Empire taught me that continuous and merciless violence is actually more powerful than the power of friendship and good intentions. The year 856 is actually pretty significant, since Shalmaneser was able to run 2 campaigns in the same year. After taking Kar Shalmaneser, He was able to spend a good amount of time taking some more nearby towns to fill out the new Assyrian province. He was able to conduct some foreign diplomacy while stationed in the town, and then still had enough resources and energy left over to head north towards the growing threat of Urartu. However, we're not going to follow him north just yet. Stepping back, looking at the big picture, Shalmaneser's reign can be divided into four main threads. His campaigns in the Levant, his campaigns against Urartu, his great intervention in Babylon, and the 7-Year Rebellion. He also peacefully managed the empire for most of that time as well, but the thing is that only the rebellion and the Babylon expedition occurred in singular, discrete chunks. Meanwhile, his western campaigns continued basically until the end of his life, and the Urartu story spans much of the same period as well. Rarely does the same year have quite so many campaigns, but the splitting of our story means that we're going to follow Shalmaneser exclusively out west for now. Then we'll go back and reset and look at Urartu and their great king. Then we'll look at what Babylon has been up to. Then probably some discussion of his peaceful activities. And finally, the Great Revolt that saw the end of Shalmaneser's life. How long will all that take? I have no idea. I write the episodes one at a time, and the story takes as long as it takes. But next episode will be a revisit of the Great Battle of Karkar, this time from the Assyrian perspective. So join us next time as we get to see the first great recorded battle of the Iron Age spiral into the first great struggle that Assyria has had to endure in over a century. Make sure whatever platform you're listening on, you're subscribed and you're liking and you're leaving comments, because that really does boost the show more than you realize. And until next time, thank you for listening.